Welcome to part 2 of this extension to my build series of videos where I look at all of the steps that didn't quite work out as well as I'd hoped and try and tweak them to make them better. One of the problems during the build that we encountered and had to work around was springback after laminating the sides. As you may recall, I took the sides out of the laminating mould early so that squeeze out could be broken more easily while the glue was still a little bit pliable. I theorised that taking it out early allowed some of the layers to slide against each other just a tiny bit, resulting in stronger, harder springback than would otherwise occur. As you can see, my Fox Bender bending mould, my laminating mould and the Solera mould all have exactly the same curve. So let's try leaving the work in the laminating mould until the glue is rock hard and see if that reduces the amount of springback we have to deal with. And now we wait for longer than we did last time. Well, it's the next day. As you can see, I've swapped over and indeed removed some of the less critical clamps so that I could glue up the other side. But I left these ones alone and these ones were strong. So let's see how it worked. Getting it to release is harder. But the important thing is, how much springback has there been? And the answer is considerably less. Still not perfect, but I think it's good. The cost, as you could see, is that getting the piece to release from the form, even with this tape, is a little harder. I'll think about ways of making that easier. But I think this is a success. This is what we're going to need to do from now on. Last time, when we trimmed the sides to fit inside the Solera mould, we did it a little bit aggressively and we had to use some interior turnbuckle clamps to get it to sit securely. Part of that was caused by springback causing an unexpected difference between this curve and this curve. Now, as you've already seen, we've largely solved that problem. The other problem was that I made my first mark and cut along it. So I've got a better process now for arriving at the perfect trimming of the ends of the sides. For the non-cutaway side, I'm fitting it into the mould. I am clamping these two side ends together and then clamping these two ends together. Not tight enough to, not so tight as to move where the waist sits. Now I can measure this gap here with calipers, and that is the amount that I need to trim off. In fact, that is a little bit less than the amount that I need to trim off because that end is going to be butting against the thickness of this piece, which slots into there. So I simply need to mark this amount from the end of this piece. For the tailpiece end of both pieces, all I really need to do is sit the piece in the mould, make sure that the waist and the bout are correctly situated and just make a mark there. Now, it's fairly inexact because we're not going to be cutting right up to it on our first cut. Now I'll do the same thing for the cutaway side. We want that line to be square, so I'm using a square. Well, I cut 5mm outside those 3 lines, but what about the 4th? That's the one that caused us most of the problems last time, and it's the hardest to get right because the piece doesn't fit in until this piece is trimmed to the right length. Now, I am lining up the waste and the cutaway as best I can against the curve of the Solera mould, and it's a lot closer than it is last time owing to the changes in our lamination process. And then I just have to make a mark where I think it is, and we'll cut 3 or 4mm outside that line and then attempt to fit the piece in. Now the piece fits in, but because it's too long, it's pushing the inner cutaway out away from the mould. Now I'll never get it to line up perfectly because there's still a tiny bit of springback, but what I need to do is trim that millimetre by millimetre until it is right without being loose, and that'll mean that this area is touching. I won't show you every step of that because I've got to move the camera in between each shot, so I'm going to zero in millimetre by millimetre until that is right. Now that piece fits in and matches the curve as closely as I could hope for, I now put the other piece in and we attempt to clamp the two together. Now they won't come together, but what they will do is let us know exactly how much we need to trim off to have everything fitting nicely. And I'm saying we need to take 3mm off each of those. Note that I cut about 5mm away from my initial mark, so that's a win that we would not otherwise have had. And here I need to cut off about 6-7mm. So I'll mark those off and do that and get back to you. After all that, I can fit the pieces into the mould and attempt to clamp the 2 halves together. Now I'm pretty happy at the tail end, although there does appear to be a little bit of non-squareness of one of the pieces. I'll be able to fix that by just sliding it against, sliding the 2 ends against each other, because we're going to be levelling in the next step. While I'm doing that, I'll also check the squareness of the sides. Pretty good there. We're out by a tiny bit there. Once again, that will be able to be fixed by sliding the sides before we do our levelling. We're good there, and we're good there. We are a little bit too long here still, and it's by about 2mm, so I need to take one more pass of 2mm off this end. After all of that, the 2 pieces fit in the Solera mould and the 2 halves clamp together. Everything is nice and tight. The curves match around the perimeter. There's still a slight deviation here, but it's better than it was. So I'm declaring this a success. I shall go and adjust my notes, and that is how our process evolves.